Welcome to Season 2, Episode 3, Chronicles of UK Salafism, an Insider Perspective. This particular episode will look at the events of 2002, and I will begin by continuing to reference what happened post Richard Reed's arrest, the shoe bomber, and the media frenzy that descended on the Brixton Mosque community. And while recounting that, I think it's important to discuss that particular day and during the Christmas week holiday, um, bank holiday, and Boxing Day, and the subsequent days, New Year's Eve, New Year's Day, because the intensity was unlike anything we had experienced or ever prepared for. And I remember on one evening after the media interviews had died down, we were informed that a van minibus had parked up on the road, which was very busy with transportation and media buses and their antennae and the like. But one van in particular, I understood it was a white van, had individuals sitting there watching, observing the events of the day outside Brixton Mosque. And even colleagues notified me that they'd found a few Molotov cocktails, petrol bombs in bottles. Those who know what a Molotov cocktail is, um, positioned around the front of the mosque, a few bottles at that, not too many. We were later to learn that that was Combat 18, an extreme far right organization that had come to the mosque. And the allegation or the understanding is that they were going to do something, an act of what we would call terrorism and vandalism, and they'd obviously decided against it. And a few days later, one of the colleagues, community members, contacted me and was bemused. He read out to me an excerpt from the BNP, the British National Party racist movement, um, an excerpt talking about my interviews and lauding me for being a good representation or representative of the British Muslim community against extremism. I'm bringing these two examples to show some of the intensity that was there. There were others that were there that we were unaware as to their identity, but it was difficult to discern who was who, and we assumed that many, if not all, those who had converged on the mosque were media of some sort. Now, I remember the moment the tide of media questioning changing because they'd gone along with our narrative, my narrative, that we had been combating and fighting extremism from our pulpit for years now, many years, the 90s in particular, warning openly against the ideology of extremism and extremist protagonists. Now, they asked for specific details, saying, well, you've mentioned your fight against extremism. Can you name who some of these protagonists are, these propagandists are? And at that particular point in time, thinking on my feet, I thought it's suitable to only mention those extremist propagandists who had already been known to the media via their own interviews with the media. So I mentioned them. Omar Bakri was always amongst the first to be called on Newsnight and mainstream news when events were taking place. Abdullah Al Faisal had given interviews in mainstream tabloid journals over the years throughout the 90s. Abu Qatada had been giving television interviews from the Four Feathers in North London, and Abu Hamza Al Masri was well known for his public views and interviews as well. I chose not to, and I decided against mentioning anybody else because they were not in the public arena. And some may ask or question me on that. When I worked in a firm of solicitors that I mentioned in the 90s, we were actually representing a particular individual who I won't mention, who was fighting extradition to America as a supporter of Osama bin Laden. Why didn't I mention him? There was no need to mention him. He was not within that cohort of very public individuals in this occasion, and was not a propagandist like the individuals that I'd actually mentioned. Suffice it to say that when I was challenged and questioned by the media in that respect, the security attention, focus, and intensity against me and Brixton increased because after being called in, after them visiting my work, which was just down the road from them, St James Park, where I worked, was just down the road from Scotland Yard. They continued to increase their visits and send cars to pick me up, to interrogate and question me as to why I didn't have anything to say to them about anyone. And my response every time is because I have nothing to say. They mentioned particular individuals and whether they were associated with Al Qaeda. I said, I don't know about Al Qaeda, and these individuals are not associated with anyone. We just know their political views and they know our political views. And it included some of the individuals I mentioned. And that was the sum total. And despite this, they still persisted in pressuring me every time I was called in or visited at work. There'd be two officers, and they would even, when calling me in, have one positioned to the right of me, just out of eye shot, and one in front of me who I was paying attention to his questions. And each time that I paused and reiterated that I knew nothing, sometimes I looked to the right and immediately they would question me upon, did I have any doubt? Was I worried about something? Why am I looking at the officer sitting to the right? There's nothing to do with anything. And it was a form of bullying that they tried to embark upon, so much so that some of my colleagues insisted, due to the pressure, that they accompany me if I'm being picked up, if I'm being called, if I'm being visited. It became very uncomfortable at work because in the Department for Education, civil service, we were working in open plan offices and they would just turn up, two of them come over to my desk, and everyone obviously would be standing and watching due to the media interviews I'd previously given. And I want to, just before I move on, I want to mention one occasion that one of the main interrogators, years later, remember I moved to Saudi Arabia, which I'm going to discuss later on in this podcast. One of them was also relocated and stationed in Riyadh. And the reason I know this is because upon visiting Riyadh on one occasion and attending the British embassy, I was told an individual wanted to meet me. To my surprise, I met this individual who had been previously interrogating me the years before, relentlessly. And when he approached me, he saw my apprehension. He asked for me to speak to him privately, and I wanted to know why. And the moment we got into a private room, the first thing he did and said, I remember this very, very clearly, he said, I want to apologize to you for the manner in which we treated you. If we knew, this is his speech, what we know now, we would never have interrogated you in the manner that conducted our interrogations. And he apologized. That was the last time that I saw him. I remember going back to Jeddah, surprised at what he had said. I later learned that he liked living in Riyadh and his secondment to Saudi Arabia, so much so that he actually resigned from the Metropolitan Police to continue his work in Riyadh. And there were other things that I learned later about his love of Saudi Arabia and consideration of converting to Islam. Whether that happened or not, I don't know. I didn't inquire any further from there. So I want to clarify a point here as well, because we live in an era where warnings against believing everything from the media are valid. That's a legitimate concern. But what we see is that those warnings are thrown to the wind when it comes to hearing news or reading news or seeing news about people we perceive to be enemies. And that's what happened in the case of Brixton. That don't believe the hype about news outlets. But if it's about Brixton or Abdul Haq Baker, we believe what we've seen, we believe what we've heard. The interviews were not edited, we heard it from his mouth. And it was amazing. Later on, when I had some very sensitive confrontations with supporters of Takfir, which resulted in a coming together, if you like, because some realized after the confrontations that they themselves were not practicing what they preach, or that they had not understood or were unaware of some of the details or context, that when put into them this dilemma, not to believe media, but when it's against someone that you don't like, then you believe everything you hear. They realized that that's true. That is something that they and many of us do. And also, there was an abandonment of a religious understanding, none other than Surah Al Hujurat, where it tells us, it enjoins upon us that when a lying, evil person, when a fasiq comes to you, verify the truth. So we put the media in that context and questioned, well, why is it you're believing everything that you're hearing when you know they edit, distort, come with a particular biased perspective when it's against somebody that is a perceived opponent of yours? So moving on from that, because I don't want to labour this point too much, I'm going to commence with particular events in 2002. This pressure that was placed on the Brixton community, some of us individually, was such that later on in the year, cracks started appearing at a very microcosmic level, a communal level, amongst some of us who'd converted to Islam together, who grew together, had known each other prior to Islam. It had caused serious ruptures because of the disagreements in how to handle media, whether others should have been involved or had knowledge of particular interviews that were taking place. And unfortunately, they ended up rupturing aspects of the management and long-standing friendships. There were other factors, of course, but these were some of the initial, I think, contributory aspects that caused this. It's reassuring to note before I start on the events that over the years since 2001, former extremists, former sympathizers of extremism, those who were non-extremists have come forward to the Brixton community, to members like myself, and actually offered apologies. Not everyone, but have offered apologies for their misunderstanding as they've seen the tide and climate of the UK security services and the liberal elements within society turning against the social conservative practice of Muslims. They've also seen that those who were sort of tongue in cheek in condemning extremism continued to do so, and that was problematic because it revealed the underlying support for elements of violent extremism and extremist propaganda. But without further ado, I think that summary was necessary to place the 2002 context that we faced following on from 9/11, the shoe bomber attacks, the revelations of Zacharias Moussaoui as the 20th bomber, and his imminent trial came to the fore. So the 31st of January saw me deliver a sermon, a khutbah, entitled Extremism in the Religion and Its Roots. Now, I commenced with an authentic narration where Ibn Abbas, one of the companions, reported from the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, quote, beware of extremism in the religion. For indeed, those before you were destroyed due to extremism in the religion. End of the quote of the hadith. When concluding the sermon, I elaborated again on the recent extremist attacks and the attempted downing of that transatlantic flight from Richard Reed, Abdurrahim as we knew him. And I referred to our rationale for continuing to confront the toxic and destructive narrative behind this extremist behavior. And I'm mentioning this at this point because those detractors, those academic detractors, the governmental agencies and think tanks that continue to place the spotlight on Salafism, Salafia, Salafis as either non-violent extremists or as a gateway to extremism, it's necessary for them to reconsider looking at how immersed we were in the fight against extremism and and ramping up that fight in our sermons and our activities. So I refer to, in concluding this part of the khutbah, this particular khutbah, to Ali ibn Abi Talib when he was asked about the defeat of the Khawarij, the early Khawarij, in the Battle of Nahrawan. And I will quote from that narration. Some asked Ali ibn Abi Talib, "Are they, the Khawarij, polytheists?" He replied, "They fled from polytheism." It was asked, "Are they hypocrites, munafiqeen?" Ali replied, "The hypocrites do not remember Allah except a little." So it was finally asked, "Then what are they, O chief of the believers?" Ali replied, "They are our brothers who transgressed against us, so we fought them for their transgression." End of narration. So this is an evidence of the balance that the Salafis, that Salafism had in combating the extremism of these individuals, but at the same time, not condemning them forthright and elevating the vitriol against personalities, as we saw, unfortunately, from some segments of our own Salafi co-religionists, because we saw narratives and behavior that was unbecoming of what Salafism stood for. And I have to say this is a profound statement for some, but it is an actuality that in my personal experience and wider engagement, that I've met individuals who were sympathetic to extremist beliefs and or extreme themselves, and I found that they were more sincere in their love for the Muslim Ummah, their love of Islam. However, the politicized understanding that they had adopted had corrupted aspects of their belief. I found them more sincere than some of the Salafi minorities who were behind this vitriol and this damning of anyone who was not adhering to their specific understanding of Islam, or who did not agree with or subscribe to the group and the methodology of that group, not of Islam, not of Salafiyah, but of the group that was emerging, that is what we know as a very toxic cult today. Proceeding forward, suffice it to say that the perceived disdain that this minority element amongst the Salafis had for wider society and the wider Muslims, because there is a problem amongst the wider Muslim populace with elements of Salafis and Salafism itself. And some of it was directed to us at Brixton and to myself as well. Hopefully, that's been tempered with an understanding of the differences between some of the Salafi entities in the UK. But that perceived disdain can only be connected or attributed to the behavior of that minority of Salafis that I've highlighted in this particular instance. And unfortunately, that negativity and the negative perceptions continue to plague most of the Salafi movement today. And it's a problem that from within still needs to be addressed. And I will say that my own community, to a greater extent, or smaller extent, however we look at it, still needs to address elements of that. However, as a convert community, it's always been a more outward embracing Salafi community, due to the fact that we are converts and that the wider community includes members of our families who are not Muslim. The next sermon that I delivered was a repeat from 2001, and that was on the 22nd of March 2002, Believers in the Times of Fitna and the Need to be Patient. On the 5th of April 2002, I delivered a sermon entitled Oppression. And from that sermon, there was a particular verse of the Quran, verses of the Quran that I cited in the beginning, and I will quote the English rendition. beginning with, and those who, when an oppressive wrong is done to them, take revenge. The recompense for an evil is the like thereof. But whoever forgives and makes reconciliation, his reward is with Allah. End quote. And I want to read my explanation of that verse, the context of that verse within the environment and atmosphere we were facing at that time. I explained, quote, revenge here is not in the way of suicide bombings, as has been mentioned numerous times before. Revenge has to be on the basis of permissible means of warfare. End quote. Again, this was the Salafi rhetoric. This was our continued combating and countering the narrative of extremist rhetoric and propaganda. The conflation of Salafis with violent and non-violent extremism continues to be a incorrect premise of the researchers, the governments, the other statutory bodies that hold this misperception. On the 19th of April, 2002, I delivered another repeat sermon from the previous year, entitled The Effects of Sins and the Need to Repent. And on the 21st of June 2002, the sermon was entitled Establishing Justice and Fair Testimony. This sermon focused on bearing false witness and hiding the truth, casting aspersions and doubts, and blind following. And again, I'm going to pause on this particular sermon and an area which I highlighted on blind following. The reason being that, as mentioned in season one, those who listened to that season and the episodes therein, that some Salafis were very, very vocal in attacks against adherents to the four established schools of thought in Islam, the Maliki school, Hanbali, Shafi, and Hanafi, and its adherents who practiced taqlid, blind following. Initially, all of us as Salafis were very vociferous in our criticism and attack. However, many of us, as we developed, and I will go off at a tangent here, I mentioned the four-stage cognitive theoretical framework I developed in my PhD. As many of us developed across that, moving from the earlier two stages to a more actualized understanding, we realized that there was an even more, if you like, reprehensible practice of blind following from some of our Salafi co-religionists that are now the cult that you hear me refer to occasionally. That particular contingent of Salafis were practicing blind following openly up until this day of a particular sheikh, senior scholar, and it therefore begged the question, why then was the Salafi movement and Salafis so vehement in chastising other blind followers of more illustrious imams, scholars, leaders from the classical era? And that's a point that needs to be revisited and addressed comprehensively. I concluded this sermon using Shaykh Uthaymeen's words, the English translation being, so I warn my brothers, the youth, and the du'at, the callers to Islam, from speaking about each other. How long will you continue to speak? How long will people continue to rekindle the flames of fitna, trials and tribulations, every time they are subdued? Close quote. I will move to the final sermon now that I delivered as a resident while living in the UK before my relocation to Saudi Arabia to take up my new career position. On the 2nd of August, I delivered a sermon entitled The Manners and Rights of a Muslim. Now, before moving on to my religious instruction and my learning of that particular year, I want to highlight an important event for me on a personal micro level. I traveled to Medina and Saudi Arabia generally with my wife. Before performing Umrah in Makkah, I visited Medina and had the honor of being invited by Sheikh Abdul Muhsin Al-Abad to his home, where he allowed me to ask some questions regarding the situation in the UK and the propagation of Islam in the UK, the Dawah. And I had my questions, It was an honor to meet the Sheikh. It was very humbling. I was in awe of meeting someone of his stature, one of the greatest Hadith scholars alive today. Um, and I remember in particular when speaking with him, one of the emerging cult members, who's a graduate from Medina, who I used to be quite close to his family, he asked a question concerning Sheikh Suhaib Hassan in the UK. And he asked it and inferred negativity towards Sheikh Suhaib. And Sheikh Abdul Muhsin's response was very emphatic. He rebuked the individual politely, but it was a rebuke, and he praised Sheikh Suhaib. And this was very significant for me because we have seen the denigration of many scholars over the past few decades from this established cult now. But yet we had here an example of a scholar endorsing a junior scholar that he was familiar with and mentioning that he was a student of Sheikh Ibn Baz and that he was a good student and a scholar and that he should be referred to in the UK. In Makkah, I also visited Shaykh Rabee, and in Jeddah, I had the honor of being invited to Sheikh Al-Abana's house. And on the last occasion, he invited my wife and I for dinner before we returned to the UK. With that, I'll move on to religious instruction now. We had a Return to Ilm, Return to Knowledge 8 conference. It was the eighth conference of that nature. And the attending scholars were those who had attended previously, plus one additional, who I can't recall his name. It was a sheikh from Cardiff, but the scholars who were attending were Sheikh Mohammed Musa Nasa, Sheikh Salim Al Hilali, Sheikh Ali Hassan Abdul Hamid Al Halabi, and Sheikh Usama Kursi. And the sheikhs on this occasion resided in my home. And that was the home I refer to where the federal agents from the US visited shortly after 9/11, which was near Brockwell Park. And I managed to share some invaluable moments with them over dinner, over walks in Brockwell Park, which would forever be a source of great comfort for me. Now, I informed them that I was scheduled to depart to Jeddah, having taken a career break from the Department for Education, from the Department of Education and Skills. And the sheikhs were unhappy about this. And I recall on one occasion when returning from a restaurant to bring back some refreshments and everything for them, they basically told me to decline the offer in Jeddah and actually confirmed that they had decided upon a fatwa prohibiting me from leaving Brixton to travel to Saudi Arabia. This caused me a great amount of consternation and discomfort, and they can see that. And for the next 2 or 3 days, while they were residing in my home, everything was going according to plan, and we were getting on well and communicating. I was persistent in my questions, asking them to withdraw this fatwa and this edict, and why have they placed such a burden upon me? And I wanted to go to Saudi for this new opportunity with my family. Now, they did not withdraw that edict, but they lightened the burden on me and said it's a choice that I can make. It's unfortunate because I felt there was a change in my relationship with them subsequent to me not following that edict or adhering to their request to remain with Brixton for the better of the Brixton community. Um, Moving on, I emigrated to Saudi Arabia, but I want to touch upon the lecture titles and what emanated from some of those lectures. So the titles were: one, The Wisdom of Ibrahim from Sheikh Usama Kursi; two, Protecting Yourself from Shaitan, from Satan, by Sheikh Mohammed Musa Nasa; three, Tuba is for the Ghuraba, for the strangers, Sheikh Usama Kursi; four, Benefits of the Quran, Sheikh Mohammed Musa Nasa again; five, Intellectual Terrorism, by Sheikh Salim Al Hilali and Sheikh Ali Hassan Al Halabi; six, Holding On to Hot Coals, by Sheikh Salim Al Hilali; seven, Jah wa Ta'dil, the methods of criticizing, by Sheikh Ali Hassan Al Halabi; and finally, the conclusive panel was question and answers with the sheikhs. Now, from the benefits of the first lecture, Sheikh Usama Kursi highlighted the difference between the people of Sunnah, the mainstream, and the extremist propaganda, in that when those who are propagating the truth accurately, when they're propagating the correct Islam, it really, if ever, brings harm upon the wider populace of Muslims or society. In contrast to the extremist narrative, that when they enact something, as we have witnessed time and time again, we see ills, problems, and tribulations afflict the wider populace of Muslims as well as the wider society. And we only have to look at a handful of actions, terrorist acts, and the subsequent events and ensuing events and heavy handedness of non Muslim societies upon Muslim societies. What happened to Iraq? What's happened in Syria? What's happened in Palestine? We only have to look at a terrorist action and then the reaction that comes from those who have more military might at this particular stage. And I'm saying this within the prism of the lecture of Sheikh Usama Kursi, that the reaction to extremist propaganda is always greater than what they've tried to enact. With the lecture Intellectual Terrorism, this addressed the witch hunt, McCarthyism of particular Salafi entities and the bullying of individuals that they perceived could be bullied. And this lecture was focusing on that. Before concluding on this conference, the question and answer session ended very controversially, because towards the end, just as the adhan for the Maghrib prayer was going to be called, Sheikh Salim was in the process of completing the question, and he swore by the Lord of the Kaaba about an event with Shaykh Rabee that reached Jeddah by the evening. And that was that Shaykh Rabee had threatened Sheikh Ali Hassan that if he did not bring down, quote unquote, denigrate Sheikh Maghrawi, a scholar from Morocco, and or Abul Hassan, who was originally from Egypt but lived in Yemen, in Maghrib, that he, Sheikh Rabee, would quote unquote bring down Sheikh Ali Hassan. And this caused a lot of tension, and there was kerfuffle in the mosque, and Sheikh Salim was very animated when he made this statement. And when I returned home with Sheikh Salim and sat with Sheikh Ali Hassan, he was not on that panel. He had finished his lectures for the day and he was there at my home, relaxing and having refreshments. He asked me, and it was translated, of course, did Sheikh Salim say this evening? And I said, yes, he did. And I asked him, was this true? Was this said to you? And he said to me, Naam, yes, it happened. It was true. Now, concluding this particular podcast, I will go through some things quite quickly. I relocated and moved to Jeddah to commence my new job before the academic year started in September at the end of August. Excuse me. The strain of that past year I've already alluded to, particularly after 9/11, had a severe impact on us in Brixton and the management and colleagues who used to be close to each other, and more splits started emerging, including long-standing friendships. Wider fractures amongst the Salafi communities across the country also began to emerge. I want to state at this point that there was absolutely no support from other Salafi communities at the time of what Brixton faced with the events post 9/11, shoe bomber events and the like. And later on, when other communities like Luton faced the Stockholm bomber attack aftermath, because he had lived in Luton, when Birmingham faced some of the events they faced in 2002, shortly after I relocated to Saudi Arabia, in one of their conferences, an individual had attempted to travel from mainland Europe and he had a gun on his person, and he was attending the Salafi publications, the Cults conference, and Abu Khadija spoke in front of the media. One of the scholars there had advised him not to, but he went against that. All of that from a distance We were ready to speak if the media approached us in support of our Salafi co-religionists, but that was not afforded to us, even though we these our events preceded theirs. I will refer to an event of that particular year, and this one will be on a local basis, as I just mentioned. And it was after arriving and settling my family in Jeddah that I received a call from one of my colleagues in the management committee requesting that I return to the UK immediately, failing which I'd be faced with the threat of being placed on the Interpol list as one of the most wanted. I remember asking him, "What's this about?" He sounded nervous. He didn't want to give too much detail. I left my family and returned to Heathrow, not knowing whether I'd be returning immediately. I left some plans in place and spoke to some colleagues that if I'm not going to return, what should be done to facilitate my family's subsequent return as well. When I arrived at Heathrow, I was met off the plane by two police officers from a newly established Muslim Contact Unit, MCU. One of the officers was Muslim, and I don't know if he was there to assure me or reassure me, but then they instructed me to attend South Norwood Police Station the following day, which I did. I'd notified my solicitor that I had to attend, and he told me to keep him posted. Now, when I attended South Norwood Police Station, I was immediately charged with attempted murder, and the circumstances of that were explained to me. After questioning and then understanding from me that I didn't know what they were talking about and that I was not involved in any such crime, they said that they would release me on bail, which was unusual for an attempted murder suspect. But one thing rang out from that arrest and subsequent bail. It was stressful enough, and the preceding year was also stressful with the events of 9/11 and the shoe bomber attack, attempted terrorist attack, still ringing loudly in my ears, and the ensuing media and everything that was taking place. Not to mention the negativity coming from a very small minority, but a loud one at that, from the Muslim community. And this is what they said to me as they bailed me, that they were concerned that what happened to Malcolm X would happen to me. And it was a concern of theirs. And that's the last words that they said to me. Now, I had to then work out with my lawyer what was going to happen. I'm on a charge that has not been removed. They've bailed me, which is very unusual. What does that mean? And in the year to come, the next 9 months, after persistently asking about the charge, was it going to still be held? Would I have to come and remain in the UK? It was eventually withdrawn with no explanation whatsoever. However, if authorities check, they will see that incident is still recorded on their official records. From this point on, in 2002, the level of securitized attention was very, very intense for me in particular, and Brixton as a community more widely, being pursued, being surveilled, even traveling to Jordan with colleagues for a conference a few years later with the Jordanian sheikhs in their al-Albani center. And after leaving my hotel where my colleagues were staying, I was traveling to the UK for a Wilton Park conference. And the secret police attended looking for me, but they weren't looking for any of my colleagues whatsoever. And I'm mentioning this and being very transparent here because I want to conclude by making it clear. I cannot speak on behalf of all Salafi entities in the UK, but I can speak on behalf of Brixton as a community and by extension Luton as well, who were very firm in our stance regarding authorities pressurizing us, and if they did not receive satisfactory answers, which they didn't by their subsequent behavior, placing pressure and insinuations that we ourselves were extreme. We continued to resist that, and our strategy was as it remains today, which was to clarify what the truth of Islam is, to clarify that Salafism has no involvement or is not a precursor to extremism in any shape or form. And this narrative has persisted up until today and will continue to persist in the future because this is the reality of Salafism. Whether other entities aligned themselves in a manner where they became informants, I use that particular word because informants are different from working in conjunction with wider societal bodies in combating extremism. But if anyone who worked in an informant capacity, providing intelligence, this is something that we will frown upon, we will warn against, we will advise others against doing. We have a verse in the Quran, again, Surah Hujurat, which is something that every Muslim should adhere to and subscribe to without any shadow of a doubt, which is none other to do not spy on one another. And I will conclude this session with that.